2024, a U.S. Navy war game in the Western Pacific simulated high-intensity conflict. The scenario was straightforward: defend against coordinated missile and air attacks over 72 hours. The results were not. Surface combatants exhausted their vertical launch system cells within the first 2 days. Ammunition ships arrived, but resupply operations took hours in contested waters. By day 3, several ships operated with depleted magazines, unable to sustain defensive fire. The exercise ended with a conclusion that made headlines quietly within defense circles. The problem was not the weapons. It was keeping them loaded. Weeks later, Japan announced a different approach to the same problem: not more ammunition ships, not faster replenishment procedures. A modular container system that treats naval munitions like commercial cargo. The U.S. Navy had spent decades refining specialized logistics. Japan bypassed the entire model. The question is not whether Japan's solution is better. It is why Japan could implement what the U.S. Navy couldn't. The ammunition problem is not new. It is getting worse. Modern naval combat consumes missiles at rates that would have seemed impossible during the Cold War. An Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries 90 to 96 vertical launch system cells. Those cells hold a mixed loadout: standard missiles for air defense, Tomahawks for land attack, anti-submarine rockets, potentially hypersonic weapons. The air defense portion typically amounts to 50 to 60 cells, depending on mission requirements. In a high-intensity scenario against a peer adversary, consumption accelerates brutally. Coordinated salvos of anti-ship cruise missiles, ballistic missile threats, swarm attacks, electronic warfare, each wave forces defensive responses. A single engagement against a coordinated attack might require 10 to 20 interceptors. Sustained operations over 2 to 3 days can deplete most of a ship's defensive magazine. And then the mathematics become uncomfortable. VLS cells cannot be reloaded at sea. A ship that exhausts its air defense missiles must either return to port or wait for an ammunition ship to conduct an alongside replenishment operation. That evolution is measured in hours, requires relatively calm seas, and exposes both vessels during the transfer. In contested waters, it becomes operationally risky. The threat generation rate has increased. During the Cold War, naval planners assumed engagements against limited numbers of sophisticated Soviet missiles. Current threat models include hundreds of cheaper missiles, drone swarms, and hypersonic weapons that compress decision timelines. The defensive ammunition budget that once seemed adequate for weeks now lasts days. Resupply tempo cannot match consumption tempo. That is the crisis. And for decades, the U.S. Navy pursued what seemed like the only solution: build more ammunition ships and make transfers faster. The U.S. Navy's answer has always been infrastructure. Build specialized ships, establish forward stockpiles, refine transfer procedures until they become as efficient as possible within the constraints of handling explosives at sea. The Combat Logistics Force includes dedicated ammunition ships, the Lewis and Clark class dry cargo, and ammunition ships designated TAC. These vessels carry missiles, torpedoes, and other ordnance specifically to resupply combatants underway. Each ship costs approximately $500 million to build, requires a crew of around 120 civilian mariners, and must be escorted in contested waters because it becomes a high-value target. Forward-basing strategy supplements the seaborne logistics. Pre-positioned ammunition stockpiles sit at Guam, Diego Garcia, Yokosuka, and other locations where host nation agreements permit. These stockpiles allow ships to reload in port rather than waiting for an ammunition ship to arrive. But each forward base requires infrastructure, specialized storage facilities, trained handling personnel, security, and defense against potential strikes. And each base becomes a target itself in conflict. Transfer methods have been refined over decades. Vertical replenishment by helicopter moves ammunition quickly but handles limited volume and cannot operate in poor weather. Connected replenishment, where the ammunition ship comes alongside the combatant, allows higher volume transfer but requires hours to rig, conduct the evolution, and break away. Even under optimal conditions, reloading a significant portion of a destroyer's magazine takes most of a day. The costs accumulate in layers. Each TAKE requires maintenance, fuel, crew salaries, and operational support. Deploying them forward means exposing valuable assets or dedicating escorts. And the fundamental tempo problem remains. Even the most efficient traditional replenishment still measures reload time in hours and days, while modern combat measures ammunition consumption in salvos per hour. Japan looked at the same problem and made a different calculation. Not better ships. A different system entirely. Between 2023 and 2024, the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force began testing a concept that defense logistics specialists initially found almost too straightforward. Standardized ammunition containers built to ISO specifications, the same dimensions as commercial shipping containers that move goods worldwide. The containers are not simple boxes. Each unit is climate-controlled, shock-resistant, and designed to protect sensitive munitions during transport and storage. They hold preloaded missiles in launch-ready configurations or organized munitions that can be transferred to ship magazines with minimal handling. The key innovation is not the container itself. It is what the container enables. If ammunition is packaged in standard containers, any vessel with container handling capability can transport it. Commercial cargo ships, roll-on/roll-off ferries, modified civilian vessels operating under contract. The specialized ammunition ship becomes optional rather than essential. Transfer operations change fundamentally. Standard container cranes equipment already present at commercial ports and on many civilian vessels can load and unload ammunition containers. No specialized rigging. No complex alongside evolutions requiring perfect sea states. The process looks identical to moving any other containerized cargo. A container crane lifts the unit from ship to dock or dock to ship. Transfer time per container measures in minutes. Stockpiles become distributed rather than centralized. Ammunition containers can be stored at dozens of civilian ports across Japan's island chain, moved by truck or rail to wherever needed, loaded onto whatever vessel has available deck space and crane access. The system treats naval ammunition as a logistics problem, not a naval vessel problem. Japan demonstrated the concept during exercises in 2024. Commercial vessels delivered ammunition containers to forward locations. Port cranes transferred them to JMSDF ships. Reload operations that would traditionally require an ammunition ship and hours of alongside replenishment completed in a fraction of the time. The concept sounds simple. The implementation reveals why the US Navy couldn't adopt it. Japan can implement containerized ammunition because of factors the US Navy cannot replicate. Legal frameworks, safety regulations, operational geography, and strategic mission all create barriers that simple technology cannot overcome. U.S. Explosives handling regulations were written in blood. After the USS Forrestal fire in 1967 and the USS Iowa turret explosion in 1989, the Navy developed strict protocols for ordnance transport and transfer. Those protocols specify vessel requirements, crew training standards, safety distances, and handling procedures. Changing them requires coordination across Navy commands, civilian maritime authorities, and congressional oversight, a process measured in years, not months. Commercial vessels operating under U.S. flag or contract face additional constraints. The Jones Act governs domestic maritime commerce. Maritime safety regulations specify what cargo civilian vessels can carry and under what conditions. Insurance companies and vessel operators show limited enthusiasm for transporting live military ordnance without extensive liability protections and government indemnification. Even if regulatory barriers could be overcome, the operational model differs fundamentally. The U.S. Navy operates globally. Carrier strike groups deploy for months at a time, operating 5,000 nautical miles or more from the nearest U.S. port. A containerized ammunition system works when friendly ports with container handling infrastructure lie within a few days steaming. It works less well when the nearest suitable port is 2 weeks away across an ocean. Japan operates primarily in home waters. The furthest point in Japan's operational area sits roughly 1,000 nautical miles from multiple Japanese ports. A JMSDF ship can return to port, reload, and return to station within days. Containerized ammunition stored at distributed civilian ports remains accessible throughout any likely conflict scenario in the Western Pacific. The U.S. cannot make the same assumption. American ships defending allies or maintaining sea control in distant theaters cannot plan on quick returns to friendly ports with container infrastructure. They must carry their own sustainability or rely on dedicated logistics ships that can meet them wherever operations demand. Geography is not the only factor. Japan's solution also reflects a different strategic calculation. Japan's defensive mission enables logistics choices the U.S. expeditionary model cannot accept. The difference is not technological capability, it is operational requirement. The Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force exists primarily to defend Japanese territory and sea approaches. Operations focus on the waters surrounding the Japanese archipelago, the Sea of Japan, East China Sea, and Western Pacific within roughly 1,000 nautical miles of home ports. In this operating area, Japanese ships remain within 1 to 2 days steaming of friendly ports equipped with container infrastructure. That proximity changes the calculus. A destroyer that expends half its magazine defending against an attack can return to Yokosuka, Sasebo, or another port, reload from pre-positioned containers, and return to operational stations within 72 hours. The ship trades some endurance far from base for much faster reload cycles near base. The U.S. Navy operates under fundamentally different constraints. Carrier strike groups project power globally. They deploy for 6 to 9 months, spending weeks or months thousands of miles from the nearest U.S. port. A destroyer assigned to a Persian Gulf deployment or South China Sea Patrol cannot return to San Diego or Pearl Harbor for resupply every few days. American ships must sustain combat operations far from home without assuming access to friendly ports. That requirement drives the traditional model specialized ammunition ships that can meet combatants anywhere in the world ocean, transfer ordnance at sea, and allow operations to continue without port calls. Japan accepts limitations the U.S. cannot. Japanese ships operating far from the home islands would face the same ammunition sustainability problems U.S. ships face globally. But Japan does not plan to operate far from home islands. The mission stays regional. The logistics can stay coastal. The U.S. mission remains global. The logistics must match. Different strategic requirements produce different solutions. Neither approach is wrong. Each optimizes for its own operational context. Japan's innovation also carries a secondary advantage that becomes visible only in conflict. In wartime, centralization becomes vulnerability. Japan's containerized system creates resilience that traditional ammunition logistics cannot match. The conventional model concentrates ammunition on a small number of specialized ships. A U.S. Navy TAKE ammunition ship becomes a priority target for any adversary. Destroy or disable those vessels, and the fleet's ability to sustain operations collapses. Adversaries know this. Anti-access strategies specifically target logistics vessels to starve combatants of munitions. Japan's container system disperses ammunition across dozens of locations. Containers sit in civilian ports throughout the Japanese island chain: Yokohama, Kobe, Osaka, Fukuoka, Hakodate, and smaller facilities. They move on commercial vessels that blend with regular maritime traffic. They can be transported by truck or rail to ports of opportunity. No single strike degrades the entire system. The targeting problem multiplies for an adversary. Instead of tracking a few identifiable ammunition ships, an opponent must locate and strike dispersed containers stored among civilian infrastructure. Attacking civilian ports that might or might not hold military ammunition creates escalation risks and diplomatic complications. The containers themselves are visually identical to commercial cargo. Surveillance assets must search wider areas with less certain identification. Redistribution happens at commercial speed. If one port becomes threatened, containers move to others via Japan's extensive domestic transportation network. If one vessel is unavailable, another commercial ship takes the cargo. The system adapts faster than traditional military logistics because it leverages civilian infrastructure designed for rapid, flexible cargo movement. In a Western Pacific conflict scenario, China would need to dedicate significant intelligence and strike resources to locate and neutralize Japan's distributed ammunition stockpiles. Meanwhile, U.S. ammunition ships, fewer in number, more identifiable, operating in predictable patterns, present clearer targets. The distributed model does not guarantee survival, but it complicates the opponent's targeting calculus substantially. These advantages are real, but they also reveal why innovation does not spread easily across different navies with different constraints. If Japan's solution works for its context, why haven't other navies adopted similar systems? The answer sits not in technology but in institutional structures, regulatory frameworks, and strategic circumstances that resist rapid change. The U.S. Navy's explosives handling culture emerged from catastrophic accidents. The 1967 Forrestal Fire killed 134 sailors. The 1989 Iowa turret explosion killed 47. Those tragedies produced safety regulations embedded deep in Navy doctrine and federal maritime law. Changing those regulations requires navigating Navy safety boards, civilian maritime authorities, congressional oversight, and union agreements for civilian mariners. The process takes years and demands proof that new methods meet or exceed existing safety standards. European navies face similar regulatory constraints, plus different geographic realities. NATO members rely on alliance port access rather than purely national infrastructure. Their ammunition logistics assume multinational cooperation and standardized replenishment procedures developed over decades. Shifting to container-based systems would require alliance-wide coordination, not just national decisions. Investment already committed creates institutional inertia. The U.S. Navy has built a fleet of TAKE ships, trained specialized crews, established transfer procedures, and invested in the infrastructure to support them. Those are sunk costs, but they represent billions of dollars and thousands of trained personnel. Abandoning that system for an unproven alternative meets resistance from the commands, contractors, and congressional districts that support the existing model. Commercial shipping companies show reluctance without government guarantees. Carrying military ordnance exposes vessels to combat risks that standard maritime insurance does not cover. Operators require liability protection, compensation for increased risk, and modifications to vessels that reduce commercial cargo capacity. Without federal indemnification programs and long-term contracts, civilian shipping companies avoid military ammunition cargoes. Cultural factors compound the technical barriers. Navies are conservative institutions by necessity. Proven systems that have worked for decades receive preference over innovations that might work better but lack operational track records. Safety culture particularly resists change when explosives are involved. The argument Japan is doing it does not overcome decades of established practice unless the innovation can be proven safer, not just more efficient. Japan possessed advantages that enabled rapid adoption. A smaller force structure allowed centralized decision-making. Recent fleet modernization provided a window to integrate new concepts. And operating primarily in home waters meant the geographic prerequisites already existed. But the larger question is not whether other navies adopt Japan's system. It is what Japan's innovation reveals about the changing nature of naval power. Naval power has always depended on logistics as much as platforms. In World War I, coal supplies determined fleet range. In World War II, fuel logistics enabled Pacific operations. During the Cold War, underway replenishment allowed sustained global presence. Each era's dominant navy mastered the logistics challenge of its time. The current era presents a new inflection point. Ammunition consumption rates now exceed what traditional logistics can sustain in high-intensity conflict. Magazine depth and reload speed matter as much as weapon range or sensor capability. A destroyer with empty VL cells is tactically irrelevant regardless of how advanced its systems are. Japan's innovation treats logistics as the primary problem and platforms as secondary. The containerized system prioritizes rapid ammunition availability over ship characteristics. That represents a conceptual shift fleet effectiveness determined by logistics architecture rather than platform capability alone. The U.S. approach remains platform-centric. Investments flow toward more capable ships, better weapons, advanced sensors. Logistics stays a supporting function, refined incrementally but not reimagined fundamentally. That model worked when ammunition consumption stayed within sustainable replenishment rates. It strains when consumption outpaces resupply. In a Western Pacific conflict scenario, Japan could potentially sustain high-intensity operations near home waters longer than the U.S. can sustain expeditionary presence at similar intensity. Not because Japanese ships are superior, but because Japanese ammunition remains accessible through distributed civilian infrastructure. American ships far from home bases face longer logistics chains and more vulnerable resupply operations. The question extends beyond Japan and the United States. Can a Navy designed for global reach maintain that reach when ammunition consumption requires frequent reload cycles? Can traditional ammunition ships operating in contested waters sustain the fleet through conflicts measured in weeks rather than days? Is the U.S. Navy's expeditionary model sustainable with current logistics architecture against peer adversaries? No consensus exists yet. Debates continue within Navy commands and congressional oversight committees. Some argue for investing in more ammunition ships and forward stockpiles, doubling down on the traditional model. Others advocate exploring distributed logistics concepts adapted to U.S. global requirements. The institutional structure resists rapid change, but the strategic environment may not permit slow adaptation. Japan did not solve a problem the U.S. Navy couldn't. Japan found a solution for its specific geography, mission, and institutional capacity. The real question is whether the U.S. can find a solution for its very different strategic challenge before logistics becomes the decisive limitation in naval power projection.